This episode of Local Film Talk was recorded in the Green Room at Natty Green's in downtown Raleigh. Perfect for business meetings or just joining friends to watch the big game, the Green Room is the ideal place to host your next event. To learn more, contact David Crack at 919-232-2477 or email david at nattygreens.com.
So, we're here again in the Green Room at Natty Green's, talking with Mike Andreas, who is currently working on a documentary about the Gulf and Tonkin, particularly the crew of the Turner Joy incident.
Yeah.
So, I guess we'll start out with, how did you get into the
Media,
industry?
right?
Media, I guess.
How did I
yes.
get into media? I guess the genesis of it was when I was a small kid, maybe 10 or 12 years old, my uncle was a security guard at Paramount Studios.
Okay.
And every summer we'd go to all my relatives were in Arizona, and we'd go visit them, and then we'd swing through California. And as a kid, my uncle would take us on tours through Paramount.
Oh, cool.
I've been on the set of Star Trek, I've been on the set of Mission Impossible, I've been on the set of Bonanza, and we would just go. We would spend, a few hours with my uncle, who was a security guard. Nobody ever questioned anything he wanted to do or any place he wanted to go, and we just wander around Paramount Studios for a day.
Very cool. And that gave you the bug.
Well, that kind of gave me the bug, and he would talk about the studios, and I, got to see a lot, and I remember once, gosh, I haven't told this story in a very long time, but I remember I was must have been about 12, because I'd been playing trumpet a couple of years.
Okay.
And we're at Paramount Studios, and we're in Glen Glen Sound, which became the recording studio at Paramount. Glen Glen was the recording studio on the Paramount lot.
Okay.
And we're in the control room. I'm 12 years old. My uncle and I are standing there, and he says, "You know what? Someday, you might work in this room." Well,
That's predictive.
And 20 years later, 20 years, maybe a little less than 20 years later, I was working in that room.
In that room?
In that room.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, in that room. I did recording sessions. I worked on Lost and The Practice and a bunch of other shows, but Lost recorded in that room.
Really?
The very last gig I did before I left LA was a recording session in that room.
Really?
And I got all the guys in the crew to sign the scores, and it was kind of fun. But yeah, so that's how did I end
circle.
How did I end up in the business? Because just my uncle and kind of being around it and seeing it, and then I didn't really think about it. I was a musician, a trumpet player, music major in school. I got kind of the composition bug.
Do you think there was more, like a better chance of making it, or more of a future in composing rather than just playing?
I didn't really think about it. I kind of thought about what I really wanted to do, and what was the best way to do it.
Okay.
After I graduated from high school, I went to UNCG in Greensboro.
Okay.
Then after my first year of college, I just realized I didn't want to. It felt like the 13th grade.
Yeah.
And I grew up in Greensboro, and I was going to school in Greensboro, and I kind of needed a change.
Okay.
So I joined the Army. I played trumpet in Army bands for 5 years.
As one does in those days, yeah.
Well, I lived in Georgia, Virginia, and then spent 3 years in Tokyo playing with the Army band.
Was that part of the appeal, just traveling,
getting out of town, getting somebody else to pay for it, and being an Army band trumpet player. It was like it was cool. We played a lot of gigs and toured and had all kinds of different ensembles, and I really got my playing together too, as a musician, as a jazz musician, as a classical player, all the stuff. Got out of that, went back to school, but all along I kept in the back of my mind thinking, well, I like playing, I like being a trumpet player, but I was very fascinated by the music. How did composers do what they did? I was never happy just being the player of my part. I was always listening to how the music was constructed and what they did and how they did it, and so it's
you
always
want to know more about the ideas.
yeah.
behind
How did it happen? How did a composer's work happen? So I ended up going to North Carolina School of the Arts.
Okay.
And still playing trumpet, but starting to take some composition and arranging lessons. And at that time, a good friend of mine was creative services director at WFMY in Greensboro.
Okay.
And she asked if I'd write some jingles for some commercials.
Oh, cool.
So I was like, sure, I'll give it a shot. The cool thing was is I had just bought a Commodore 64 and some of the early MIDI software, and I had an old DX7 and an old drum machine, and I would show up at the studio with the computer and the MIDI stuff and the keyboard, and the studio was like, well, when's the band get here? And I'm like, that's the band.
Oh, no.
The band's,
That's the band.
The band's in the trunk of my car. So that kind of got me to thinking about writing and doing jingles, and then the computer part too, like learning about MIDI and sequencing and time code and all of those things. I've always
that ends up working out well for you because as we found, technology has turned out to be the driver of a lot of stuff, and you really got to be on top of that sort of thing in order to stay relevant.
And so I did that for a couple of years, did quite a few jingles with her and a couple of things, and I realized that I was hitting the limit of what I could learn here in Greensboro in North Carolina.
Okay.
I had kind of hit the limit of what I could do on my own.
Okay.
And so my wife and I decided that we were going to go somewhere where I could learn more, get better, and come back, or learn more and work somewhere. So we packed up and moved to LA.
Out to California.
Yeah.
Okay.
We moved to LA, kind of landed there. I worked at a computer store. We did whatever we had to pay the bills, and I started networking and networking and networking and networking.
There's a lot more competition out there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like here in North Carolina, you had a friend who worked at the station, was like, yeah, I know a guy, I'll give him a call about doing some jingles, and then you get to LA and it's not that easy anymore.
Well, I think I was doing some trumpet playing. I was playing in a lot of pickup bands, little sessions, little like low budget movie sessions and things, and I had a friend who was a trumpet player, a studio trumpet player, and I was talking to him about it, and he's like, yeah, you're a pretty good trumpet player. You do all right. I'd say you're in the top couple of dozen guys in town. And I was like, oh, wow. And he said, unfortunately, there's 7 or 8 guys working every day. So unless you're in that top 7 or 8 guys, you're going to work a couple times a month, and that's just not going to pay the bills.
Yeah, you'd think being in the top 20 in anything is going to be really great, but there's just not that much demand.
When I joined the union in LA, there were 500 trumpet players in the union book.
Wow.
It's like, yeah. It's
the
a big
competition
C.
even here is pretty stiff.
Yeah, it's a pretty big C.
Okay. I noticed on your credits on the IMDb, you've got a lot of, I think your first credit is as a trumpet player.
Right.
I guess just as a studio session for, was that a movie or a TV show?
So it was I think it was a made-for-TV movie. If I remember correctly, it was called Afterburn. Is that the one you saw?
Might have been.
I'm trying to think who even scored that. I'll have to dig. That's a long time ago. The way I ended up getting my first gigs were, I was working in a computer store in North Hollywood, and this is 1991, 91.
All right.
Just when everything's going computers.
Okay.
Most of these guys were pen and paper guys, and they were being drugged screaming into the computer age. They discovered that I was a musician who understood computers. So I started doing consulting for guys. I'd come over to their house and teach them how to run Microsoft Word. I'd teach them how to do notes, how to do spotting notes for sessions, how to format text. And because I was a musician, they would start asking me about, well, do you know about MIDI and sequencing? Oh yeah, I can help you with that. And so I became valuable to these guys as a consultant.
Okay, yeah.
And then, sort of if there was a big break, it was one of the guys I had been helping with his computer system was Michael Dietrich. He's a music editor in LA. I think he's still out there doing a lot of stuff. He's one of the top handful of guys out there. He called me one night about 10 o'clock at night. He's like, hey, it's Michael, what you doing? I'm like, getting ready for bed. It's 10 o'clock at night. He says, well, I'm working on a project. We kind of have a disaster, and can you come over?
Okay.
And I was like, well, like in the morning? He said, no, like now. I'm like, well, okay, so, oh yeah, I'm on my way.
Okay.
Turns out it was Stuart Copeland, the drummer for the Police.
Really?
And Michael was his music editor, and they had several projects at once. They were working on a feature, an opera, and Stuart was writing in the Fairlight. He was writing all the music in the Fairlight.
Really?
But they'd hired a New York orchestrator who was a strictly pencil and paper guy. Nobody had figured out how to get Stuart's music out of the computer and onto paper so that the pencil and paper orchestrator guy could go to work.
Really?
So I spent 17 straight days transferring his MIDI files out of the Fairlight into a Mac Plus onto paper so that we could fax it to a guy in New York to orchestrate it.
I was going to say, back then they didn't have the software that would put it on the sheet.
Well, they
like
did.
Make sheet music out of it, and then you could just print it out.
Finale had just come out,
Okay.
and I was one of the only maybe a dozen guys in LA that had it.
Oh,
So I was,
there you are in that top dozen.
I was
That's
another.
what gets you in
There were a dozen guys that knew how to do that at the time, and I got the call. So
Cool.
I did a lot of work with Stewart over the years. I played trumpet with him. I eventually got to do some conducting and orchestrating.
I noticed you had some conductor credits on there.
Yeah, I did a lot of work with Stewart. We had about 5 years we worked together.
And you did some studio movies too. My favorite of which being Hellboy.
Oh yeah, Hellboy.
I love Hellboy.
Hellboy.